So our next speaker has actually been at Origins. He spoke way back, I believe, in 2014, and he spoke about the Sirius mystery when we ran the conference at Rudolf Steiner House. And since then, he's spoken at Megalithomania on several occasions. He's the author of some best-selling books, including The Sirius Mystery, The Crystal Sun, Netherworld, The Sphinx Mystery, and many others. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Robert Temple.
Now, before I commence my main talk, which I've been asked to give, I'm going to give you the very first British announcement of the completion of a project in Egypt, a very important one. My wife Olivia and I run the Ancient Egypt Foundation, and through that, for the past 5 years, we have been funding the cleaning of the astronomical ceiling at the temple at Esna in Egypt. Esna is on the Nile, and it's about an hour's drive south of Luxor. Not a lot of people have been there to see this old temple that partially survives. Fortunately, the part that does survive is the part that has the astronomical ceiling. And what's happened is that a joint team of Egyptians and Germans, funded by Olivia and me for the past 5 years, have meticulously cleaned the ceiling. And it's quite spectacular what's been revealed. Suddenly, all the tour groups are going to Esna, which they didn't very often before, because the paint colors are the brightest now of any that survive in any Egyptian temple. And the reason for that is strange, because the ceiling was obscured by black soot so that you could hardly see it. That was from fires, cooking fires over centuries. And so it was known that it was an astronomical ceiling, but if only we could see it. And now we can. So the colors are amazingly bright, and the information is really very extensive. There's a zodiac depicted there, which is, I think, better than the one at Dendra. There are, by the way, only 2 astronomical ceilings in Egyptian temples that survive. The Dendra one is very famous, and then that's a gigantic temple, as you probably know. The Esna Temple is a small one, and it was the temple of Khnum, that's K-H-N-U-M, try and say that one, Khnum, who was the creator god who created man from clay on his potter's wheel. And his other place of residence, apart from Esna, was the island of Elephantine, further up the Nile, one must say, even though it's south, we say up. And the temple is shared with the goddess Neith, who was the goddess of Sais up in the delta. And they share the temple between them, and I think they got on very well. And so the part of the temple that's been preserved is what's called the pronaos. That's pro as in front of, and naos is the Greek word for nave. So you go into a cathedral, you enter the nave, but if you were an ancient Greek, you would enter the naos. So this is the pronaos. So he, him, it, choose your pronaos. Bad joke. So, especially in these times, mustn't make fun of pronouns. So, it's very high and majestic, and it has this tremendous astronomical ceiling. Here's the team. Now, the chap who's crouching there is the photographer who set the timer in the front. And that's me and Olivia at the back in the center. To the right of me is the head of the Egyptian team, Hisham El-Laythi, who is a very fine fellow indeed. And then beside Olivia is Professor Christian Leitz of the University of Tübingen. And his wife is beside him, Dr. Daniela Mendel. She's also an Egyptologist. And beside her is Dr. Daniel von Recklinghausen. He's also an Egyptologist. It's surprising to see so many Egyptologists in Egypt, isn't it? And there they all are. Now, this team has spent 5 years very, very meticulously standing on very, very high and perilous surfaces, cleaning everything so carefully so as not to damage anything. And I think you'll be delighted to see some of the results. Now, I'll show you the view of the temple itself. This is, it was half covered with sand until about 100 years ago. For a long time it was, I didn't mean to do that, but for a long time it was used as a cotton store by the local traders because it was on the river by a port, you see, by a wharf. And so that was useful for them, and which is why they did not destroy the building. They used it to store cotton for centuries. And then after that finished, then all the people moved in, the fishermen and so on, with their cooking fires and covered the ceiling with soot. Now here we see the team on the scaffold working away. You can see how dark that ceiling is there. And then here's what began to come out. Now, you can see that the colors are very bright, and there's another portion. Let me just take a look. Yes. Is that, in fact, relates to what we were just hearing about from Andrew Collins about vultures. Those are vultures, protective vultures with their wings outspread, a whole row of them across the ceiling, offering their protection, sacred protection. So you see the vulture's sacred quality is very ancient. And, but that's nothing to do with eating corpses. It's all to do with the tremendous enfolding wings that can keep you safe. So I'll show you some more. Oh, here we are. So there's the constellation the zodiacal sign of Taurus. And we have the whole zodiac like that, beautifully done. And you can see that was black, but now has beautiful color. And you can see how high the scaffolding was that they were working on. And it's a very, very tall building. That's the University of Tübingen's press release. And there are the columns. And now it's open to the tourists now. It was basically closed during most of the work. And so the temple is the last of the Egyptian temples to be made. It was actually constructed during the Roman times, commencing in the reign of the Emperor Claudius. And one of the reasons why it's so important, apart from the fact that it's had this brilliant astronomical ceiling preserved, is that the priests knew that the jig was up, as they say. The American gangsters say that. I'm sure you don't know any of them. That basically everything was coming to an end. And so they crammed the ceiling full of information and the columns. There are new creation texts there which are about to be studied. There were 120 painted texts, the existence of which was completely unknown until all the soot was gone. You could sort of see the impressions of the carved bits. And we discovered, to our absolute astonishment, something unknown before in Egypt, that the complete phases of the moon were depicted night by night on the ceiling. So you have the first part of the month with the waxing and growing bigger every day, and you have a different moon for each night, you see, until it's full. And then you have the waning row, where it starts big and gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And they depicted the moon every night for a month on the ceiling. We know that they were paying a great deal of attention to the moon, but we have never before seen anything like that. And of course, the texts that go with it are interesting. So we also have the names now of all the constellations, the hieroglyphics of which have been uncovered. Some were known, of course. but then some were not. We also have wonderful pictures of the north, south, and east and west winds. And it's just a huge phantasmagoria. And 6 volumes are now being prepared to show all the pictures and all the commentary. And Professor Leitz is going to have to spend the rest of his life interpreting the astronomy. He's the world's expert on ancient Egyptian astronomy, so if anybody can do it, he can. And von Recklinghausen is particularly strong on the creation texts. So it's all in good hands. And the cleaning is going on. We're funding another year for them to clean a wall that's still dirty, which is related to the seedling. So that is our achievement. And the Prime Minister visited it. That's not the British one, not Rishi, the Egyptian one. And it's been named an Egyptian prestige project, a national prestige project. They're going to have to build a hotel for the tourists because nobody ever stayed in Esna before. And so basically the Egyptian government is thrilled for non-archaeological reasons as well, because we've basically created a new fabulous tourist site, which means more money because they need the money in Egypt, which comes from tourism. And the minister in charge of antiquities is now called the Minister for Tourism and Antiquities. So if you can create a new tourism site to help Egypt survive the economic perils of the moment, especially with the Ukraine grain problem, because the main thing in Egypt is bread, and they have to have the grain, then it's helping the economy. And we want the Egyptian economy to be helped because we want to be able to visit more and more antiquities, don't we? Okay, so that is Esna. Do put it on your bucket list. Thank you. And so now I've written this book called A New Science of Heaven, which some here have actually read, and they get the gold star. I also recorded an audio version of it because some people prefer listening to reading. Most of our young friends like to listen. They don't read very much. Anyway, both are available, and there's even an ebook, although I've never actually used an ebook myself. And the book really kind of opens up a lot of new stuff. It's written without. It's basically about science, but it's not that technical. It doesn't have a single equation. It's written for people who don't necessarily know any science, trying to explain some crucial aspects of science that have not been explained before, and will explain to you why it's important. But I think I'll start in a way I haven't before by talking about biophotons, which some of you will have heard of. Now, photons are light particles, as you probably know, and why would they be called biophotons? Well, that's because some photons are emitted by bodies. And now, the spontaneous emission of biophotons by this man took place in the complete dark, and this exposure, I think, took 2 hours using photomultipliers, which were only invented in the 1950s, to increase the visibility of this ultra-weak radiation of photons. All this light has come from that man's body spontaneously. None of it is reflected. And it's been enhanced by the photomultipliers so that you can see it more clearly. Now, you can see his head, his eyes are clearly not emitting as much, and the top of his chest, but not much down here. And so biophotons are very important, and I'll begin to show you one of the reasons why. Here's another one, and by this and the next image as well, we have clear evidence that the Chinese system of acupuncture is valid, and that because these are the meridians emitting the biophotons, you see. And so obviously something is happening along those meridians that's causing the photons to become excited, the electrons to become excited and emit the photons. And so that is what the Chinese call qi. And earlier today we heard qi mentioned in connection with the shamans and so on. It has many names, but qi will do. And I will be explaining to you that in fact it's plasma, the flow of plasma. I'll explain about that in a moment. But I want you to see this and think no more doubt about acupuncture being real, because these are the meridians. There's really some energy flowing along those meridians, and we've got the proof of the biophoton emissions from the meridians here, and that would be probably a 2-hour exposure as well. Here's another one. You can see that's even clearer about the meridians being really hot spots down the legs. And a great deal more work needs to be done on this subject. The problem is that funding dried up. There was a huge explosion of biophoton research in the 1990s, and then no more money could be found from any source. And it seemed that there were various dark forces that didn't want any more of this done. And so the work basically stopped. And then most of the biophoton researchers died off. Some are still around. I know several of them, but they're elderly. And there's only one young one that I know, and he's in Russia. This whole thing was started by a Russian scientist called Gurevich, who was the first person to suggest that there were such things as fields in biology. He was back in the 1920s, Russian. He fell foul of Stalin and wasn't able to do research for a long time. I was in touch with his grandson, Lev Belousov, a very brilliant biophoton researcher, and we were just putting together a website for all of Gurevich's work. And then he suddenly dropped dead of a heart attack, which did not help matters. But his protege is the young man I mentioned. And he's just publishing a big book on biophotons in January in English. So his name is Ilya, I-L-Y-A, Ilya. And his surname, you probably wouldn't be able to remember this very easily, Volodayev, V-O-L-O, Volo, D-Y-A-E-V. But anyway, this book is coming out in January. You could keep your eye out for it. It'll be sold on Amazon. I've pre-ordered my copy. So that's an aspect of the main talk, the biophoton aspect. I thought I'd mention it first because in this particular audience, most of you, well, all of you will know of acupuncture, and most of you will probably have had it. And I know that you, in particular, will have a strong interest in it. So I thought I'd start with that. And anybody who says to you, I don't believe in acupuncture, give them a good kick. Now, this amazing picture is done by a Swedish chap about 100 years ago, showing a very, very big aurora borealis indeed. And you can see at the time of sailing ships. There's a whole host of such pictures. I thought I'd show you this one because it's particularly dramatic. But the aurora borealis was studied by a Norwegian scientist called Christian Birkeland. I was being a Norwegian for a moment there. They actually do sing as they talk. We shouldn't say Birkeland, which is how it's spelled. We should at least go halfway and say Birkeland. And he spent years going up and freezing almost to death in the high north to study the aurora borealis because he believed that it was caused by charged particles coming from the sun. Now, at the time he was called mad because all scientists who discover new things are always called mad, and if you're not called mad, you haven't discovered anything. he was called mad because everybody knew, the big E everybody, as in establishment, they all knew that outer space, as it was then called, was empty. Perfect vacuum. And hence, there couldn't be anything coming from the sun because there was no medium of transmission. How would you get anything coming from the sun to cause this if outer space is empty? As we know it is. Oh, they knew it. How did they know it? Well, they just sort of knew it. And it was a perfect vacuum because it must be, because it's out there and it's not here. So he was mad, but he turned out to be right. And the work that he did was so fantastic. He became very famous, and he was even his portrait was put on the 200 kroner currency note of the Norwegians, and that's something that will never happen to any of us. So his sort of disciple was a Swedish man called Hannes af Wien, and many of you will have heard of him because he was basically the founder of the electric universe theory, which many of you will have heard of. And the real founder was, of course, Birkeland. And so Alf Venn came. He was also mad, of course. So you have to be mad to discover anything. But he did get the Nobel Prize in the end. A lot of mad people do get it in the end when they're finally proved right. And so he came up with his cosmology of how the planets were formed and what the sun is and does, and that, of course, space isn't empty, and everything's caused by plasma and so on, which led to the electric universe theory. And he just went on and on and on. And, of course, we now know that he was correct. Then after him, there's a chap called Parrott, who works for the American government, who is who actually is the next person after Alf Wien to pursue this theory, and he had a big impact. And then there were the two men, both of whom I have been fortunate to know, but one of whom died not long ago. That's Wolf Thornhill in Australia, that some of you will have heard of, and he had a website about the electric universe theory called the Thunderbolts Project, and then Don Scott. Now, here's a photograph taken by Don Scott of something called a Birkeland current. I have to explain what that is. You may have seen pictures of the cosmic web, and we will see them later. You've got all these filaments all over the place in the universe. Filaments. Why are all these filaments? You've got them in the brain, and filaments are everywhere. That's because they're carrying current, normally electricity, which is negatively charged current. There is a positively charged current as well. And the idea of Alf Wien, but of Birkeland himself first, which is why they're called Birkeland currents, later named after him, was that the universe has electricity being transmitted all over through filaments, and like threads, which form a kind of web, and they carry electrons at vast speed. In fact, it's been suggested at the speed of light, by a means called superconductivity, which means that the current is able to go along without resistance. And so he took this photograph of a Birkeland current as a slice, a vertical slice. So the current is actually coming directly at you in the picture. But in order to understand how it was working, this slice shows that it's coming at you. First of all, it's spiraling. It's not going straight. It's spiraling. It always spirals. And but in a Birkeland current, it's counter-rotating. So you've got one circle going this way, clockwise, and the other going counterclockwise. And so he showed all this, and they made a lot of progress in studying such things. And the electric universe theory, just to summarize it in a couple of sentences, is that the universe does not work in the way that most cosmologists think, but works by having electricity going from star to star in these things, the filaments. And just to give you a bit more about that, I'll just explain what's wrong with the conventional theories of our sun. Now, in the 1920s, Sir Arthur Eddington, good chap that he was, did the best he could to explain where the energy of the sun was coming from. And the best he could think of then, and it's perfectly reasonable then, 100 years ago, was to say, well, you know, I think the only way all this energy could be produced is by having nuclear fusion taking place in the center of the sun, what we would now call a hydrogen bomb. And so you have hydrogen being fused into helium and in a hydrogen bomb type of explosion at the center of the sun. And that's the only way he could think of all the energy coming. And now there are lots of problems with that. One is that it's now realized that if that were the case, and most establishment scientists still say that it is the case, but I'm sure they're wrong, it would take 200,000 years for the energy from the explosion to reach the surface. So according to that theory, the energy coming out of the sun now was generated 200,000 years ago. Now, there are lots of problems with that whole theory. One is that, I think it's 20 or 30 years ago, suddenly the solar wind, which is all the stuff coming out of the sun, stopped. Just stopped. Nothing. And for 2 whole days, there was nothing. The sun just didn't emit anything at all, except light. And then it started again. Now, as I pointed out in my book, which I'm sure you're all going to read avidly over and over, the idea of having a hydrogen bomb that you can turn off and turn on again 2 days later, despite the fact that what you're turning on and off happened 200,000 years earlier, that's kind of a problem. There's another technical problem, which is not enough neutrinos are being emitted by the sun for that theory, but they try not to mention that. But there are countless other things. And so let's talk about the sun being cold. Now, we all think the sun must be really furiously hot, especially if it's got a bomb going off in the middle. But guess what? The closer you get to the sun, the colder you get. So it's surrounded by this very distant corona, which is millions of degrees hot, you know. So that's a very hot thing. And you wouldn't want to have to go through that. And then you come down to the chromosphere. That's a lot less hot, but still very hot. You reach what we call the surface of the sun, the technical name of which is the photosphere. That's the bubbly bit that looks angry, as if it wants to spit at you, and sometimes it does. That's the thing where you see all the sunspots and the filaments coming up and the things shooting out. That's what we call that. We call that the surface of the sun, although it's not solid, of course. And so the temperature there is only 5,500 degrees Celsius. Wait a minute, hold on, 5,500. Wasn't it just millions of degrees higher up in the corona? How did it drop down to 5,500 degrees? If you go down a sunspot, which is a hole in it, by remote means they've figured all this out, the temperature drops to 3,900 degrees. So you're getting colder the closer you get to the center of the sun. So how can there be a hydrogen bomb going off in the center of the sun? If you get colder the closer you get to it? Everybody knows that when you have a stove, it's warmer when you get next to it and colder when you're on the other side of the room. Well, with the sun it's the opposite. So clearly the sun is not being powered by a hydrogen bomb. Forget it. So what is happening? What's happening is the electric universe theory. These things, giant ones, and there's one of these things that's very, very big that extends for 100 light years apparently, which has been seen. But they siphon electricity into the poles of the stars. And that's negative charge, and push the positive charge out, because the solar wind that fills our solar system is mostly positively charged protons and positively charged ions, and which are opposite to the electrons, which are negative. And so this is going on the whole time. So the sun's getting its energy through these things. They go from star to star, and the whole space is now called the cosmic web, because you see these filaments everywhere joining all the stars. But what has happened is that the thinking of the cosmologists is not yet as joined up as the stars are. They haven't quite been able to face the fact that what they were taught at school is wrong. And they don't want to be the first to say, "Teacher, I think you've made a mistake." Okay, you lose your job now. We live in a cancel culture as it is, but if you're a scientist, you are so much more in danger of being canceled, because if you step out of line, if you say anything that's unconventional, you don't get your next grant. And if you say a second thing that's unconventional, you're out. You lose your job. And they'll come up with some excuse, like you ate cake. But you'll be out. And so basically all academics live in a reign of terror. If they step out of line, they lose their jobs, they lose their grants, they can't pay the mortgage, their wives half the time leave them, their careers and reputations are destroyed, they've got nothing. So they cannot say what they're really thinking. They dare not, because they're all living in a reign of terror and fear. That is the academic world. And it applies to scientists even more so, because they might say the wrong thing and threaten a huge commercial interest. Like some big company, choose your favorite one or the one you hate the most, and they're funding whole groups of scientists. And if you say something that goes against their interests, you're gone. And if you say something that's against the interests of certain secret levels of different governments who are promoting various things for reasons of their own, which we don't know, and you wouldn't know that either, and you say the wrong thing, you're gone. They can't have anybody contradicting what's happening. So you see, these people live in fear, and that's why they don't want to even look at that picture. Now it's getting interesting. This is a plasma crystal. It's made entirely of plasma and dust. So we thought we knew all about crystals, did we? Well, we've got a lot more to come. Let me tell you what plasma is now. Plasma is another kind of matter. It's not made of atoms. Now, we live in the physical world, which is made of what we call physical matter. Its other name is atomic matter because it's made of atoms. Plasma does not have atoms. Plasma is made of atomic particles. Electrons are the negative jobs. Protons are the positive jobs. And then there are things called ions, which are, some people would say, incomplete atoms. They're not quite all there, haven't got all their marbles. And they tend to have a positive charge. Now, those are the things that compose plasma. Now, I've got a surprise for you, for those of you who haven't read my book over and over and over and over, which I hope you all have really secretly. The thing is that the universe is made of plasma, not atoms. 99.99% of the universe consists of plasma, not of atoms. Now, just think what this means. This means that physics, as it exists and we know it, and as we were taught in school, if we were taught any at all, is all wrong in terms of studying the universe. Of course, it's very useful here on Earth because it describes what happens with atomic matter. Oh, we know all about that now. What we don't know about is 99.99% of the universe. Because in order to understand it, you have to have a new physics. And if you don't have it, you can't get anywhere. Now, there are some very hardy fellows and gals who are working on this new physics on the sidelines. Some of the very earnest plasma physicists, the ones that haven't been gobbled up by the controlled fusion projects, and some scientists working on a very new branch of physics called topological physics, which I won't even try to explain that one to you at the moment, and the physics of information, something that was very strongly pushed forward by my very great friend of yesteryear, David Bohm, who has been mentioned several times today. And David's latter part of his life was taken up with this physics of information. Now let me just say a word about information. It's more than what we think. Einstein had his famous equation, E equals mc squared. Nobody knows what it means, but they do know it's E equals mc squared, whatever that is. And so the E stands for energy, and the M stands for mass, you see, and the C is the speed of light squared for some reason. And we don't know why. But the thing is that according to that, the transformation of energy into matter and matter into energy is mediated by the speed of light, basically. That's what it means. And that's why matter and energy, they can't go faster than the speed of light, according to the special theory of relativity of Einstein. But what he forgot about was that information does not have mass and does not have energy. It is therefore unrestricted by the speed of light. So you can have instantaneous telepathic communication over any distance in theory, according to plasma theory and information theory, because the speed of light doesn't come into it. So when I revised my earlier book, The Serious Mystery, in 1998, I expanded it by 50%. So if you're ever interested in that book, don't read the earlier edition, which is superseded. I said in chapter 1, I think it was, that in my opinion, the reason why Sirius was so important, as I explained in that book at great length, is because our solar system and the Sirius star system are in the same cell within the galaxy. And this can only be understood once you know about plasma physics, because cells exist which are surrounded by sheaths, which are double-layered things which keep that thing separate. And I believe that the Sirius system and the solar system are in the same sheath-lined cell. It's a very small cell. It's only 8.6 or 8.7 light years in width. That's nothing in terms of the galaxy. And I think that is something that explains a lot, but I can't go into all of that because it's a separate talk, because I'm not really talking about the serious mystery here. But I just mentioned that because it was only since I published that in 1998 that I came to understand how this would work and how it could be possible. I suggested it because it seemed to me that it was a necessity, but I couldn't explain how it would be done. I even named it the Anubis cell in honor of the dog god, because of the dog star, you see. And I now know from the plasma physics how it would be possible for this cell to exist. So I mentioned that in passant hurriedly. So now, with plasma is in every molecule of your body. Another great friend of mine was a very brilliant bioenergeticist and cell biologist called Peter Mitchell. He was called mad for 20 years, of course. In fact, he was called worse than mad. He's totally crazy. And they used to say to students at Cambridge, now there is a chap called Peter Mitchell. Do not read his papers. He's completely crazy. Don't waste your time. Of course, Peter ended up winning the Nobel Prize in 1977 because he proved he was right. What he proved was that every cell in the body has plasma currents going through the membrane. He didn't use the word plasma at that time. They called them proton currents, but protons are particles, and proton flow is a plasma flow. So, and he had been preceded by Albert Szent-Györgyi, whom I also knew, who was the first person to say that the human body was full of semiconductors, organic semiconductors, which you need to be able to modulate the flow of electricity in a body. That was a very bold pronouncement. And he also said that plasma was filling the body. And so, of course, he was mad. It's terrible, the things that were done to St. Georgie. He had won the Nobel Prize as well, but the fact is that he was getting in the way of people. I explain this in my book. I won't go into it all. But the fact is that everybody who was trying to advance plasma physics was canceled. They were called mad. They were insane. Don't speak to them. Don't read their papers. And in the case of Wilhelm Reich, who hasn't been mentioned here today, what happened to him? He was running Freud's clinic in Vienna. He fled in 1933 because of the Nazis. And then he ended up in America eventually. I think 1939, eventually he got there. And his books were burnt by the Nazis. And because he's no good, he's mad, naturally. So what happened? He got to America. He lived in the state of Maine, quite isolated, doing his work, writing his books about plasma energy, which he called orgone energy. And the FBI turned up, and they took him into custody, and he had to stand there and watch them take all his books out of his house and burn them. The FBI burnt his books, just as the Gestapo had burnt his books. I mean, you can't get away from book burning, can you? You cross the Atlantic and it still happens to you. And then they seized all his papers and took them away. And they had his various devices he prepared and chopped them up with axes in front of him. He never received any financial compensation. I don't know that he was ever even charged. He was put in jail on some trumped up thing or other, a threat to national security or whatever they want to say. And then, just as he was about to be released, he mysteriously died in prison. Figure that one out. So, that was Wilhelm Reich. He was canceled with extreme prejudice. And so his orgone energy was connected with the human orgasm. He wrote a book when he was still in Austria called The Function of the Orgasm. Well, everybody was scandalized because, of course, Austrians didn't have them. And he sort of survived that, but he not for long, and fled. But the orgone theory was that, considering that the human body is full of plasma, that the orgasm is not really a sexual function. It's been hijacked by nature to accompany procreation because nature wants babies. But basically, the orgasm per se is a plasma phenomenon. It's a sudden contraction and expansion of the body's plasma in this violent fashion. And it makes people feel good. And it's actually a plasma explosion. It's connected with sex because it encourages and facilitates reproduction. This is nature's plan. Anyway, I won't go further into orgasms, and I promise not to have one. I hope you don't either. But there's another person persecuted, and he actually died. And so it doesn't matter who you are, how many Nobel Prizes you've won, if you go against them, meaning the mediocrities known as the establishment, the commercial interests, and the security interests, they will come for you. And you will certainly be called mad, you will be persecuted, and there's no end to it. Anyway, that's what you have to put up with. So then what happened was that plasma research had to be continued because they want to try and contain fusion reactions. And it turns out that plasma is crucial to the trigger mechanisms for hydrogen bombs. There we are with hydrogen bombs again. And they have something called pinches, which is very naughty. If you pinch somebody, you might make them explode. Well, it's called a Z pinch, or in America they would say a Z pinch. I won't go into what it is because I wouldn't want you to try it on your friends. But the fact is that plasma had to continue being researched. Now, I started looking into superconduction of electricity within the body back in the 70s, and there was a man called Freeman Cope who was doing all this. And I discovered that he had published a lot of papers in a very obscure journal that was mostly just read by people like him, and there were only 6 of them, that dealt with Reich's research. And it became very clear to me that the FBI had given all of Reich's files to the naval intelligence, which is what Freeman Cope worked for in their science department, the scientific research department of the naval intelligence. They were the tops. The Army were pretty good. The Air Force, no good. The Air Force were pretty good. The Army were no good. But the fact is that each branch of the military had its own science division for secret stuff that might kill more people, because they have to kill more people all the time. And there was Freeman Cope, and he published these papers about Reich's work, which he could only have done by quoting the unknown papers which he'd been handed by the FBI. So that's what happened to Reich's papers. They gave them to the naval intelligence people. And Freeman Cope was given the thankless job. Well, Freeman, you're writing about all this fast electricity in the body. I mean, you're into weird stuff. I think we'll give these things to you. You tell us what they are all about and give us reports, okay? Sure enough, sir. And so Freeman Cope went through all of Reich's secret papers and wrote these fabulous papers. Then suddenly he stopped and he died young. And that was the end of Freeman Cope. But the thing is that we now know, because I discovered it, what happened to Reich's papers that the FBI seized and what use was made of them. And the FBI, of course, had no possible way to evaluate them. They don't have a science team like that. It's the other intelligence agencies that do that, and that's exactly what happened. So I mention that because it's a kind of continuation of the story of Wilhelm Reich, which began back with him talking about the orgasm in 1929 Vienna. And he was running Freud's clinic for him because Freud was too lazy. Also, Freud was a failed hypnotist, which is why he developed his particular free association technique. That's another story. So now we have all the plasma research going on, and we discover that plasma can exist in gaseous form, liquid form, solid form, and crystal form. And that is a plasma crystal. And here is another one. Come on. And now the thing is that you can only get them when there's dust in them. You have to have dust to get the crystalline formation. And these crystals are made in the laboratory, of course, so they're very small. But in space, they're all out there. All those photos that you've seen of the Horse's Head Nebula and all that kind of thing that are so colorful and amazing to watch, these great photos in color of the universe, gas clouds and so on, those are plasma clouds filled with dust. And people talk about dark matter. Well, let me tell you, plasma exists in different states. It exists in the dark mode, the glow mode, and the arc mode. That's the blazing kind. So the sun is completely made of plasma. I forgot to mention that. All stars are completely made of plasma. And they are in the arc mode because they're blazing. If something's glowing like one of those nebulae that you see in the astronomical photographs, then it's glowing. That's the glow mode. And then there's the dark mode that you can't see because it emits no light. And that is dark matter. And you've got all these scientists scratching their heads and getting tied up in knots and saying, well, we don't know what dark matter is. It's out there. We know it's there, but we don't know what it is. Well, I can tell you what it is. It's plasma that's in the dark mode. That's simple. What's wrong with them? Why don't they understand this? What could be more simple than that? So, now this brings us to a very surprising revelation. Oh no. Well, this is actually very useful because this is microscopic views of dust. I want you to see how dust can vary. Dust from sandstone is number 4. Dust from needle grinding is number 5. Dust from a sawmill is number 6. Dust from a silk factory is number 7. And dust from felt is 8. You can see they're completely different, and yet we think of them just as dust, but dust varies. And this was done way back, well over 100 years ago, to study the effect of different types of dust on the lungs. Just so you can see how varied dust is. This is a creative photograph taken by Zetta Whitehead. I don't know quite how she does it, but basically our bodies are completely surrounded by dust clouds and plasma in the dark mode, although sometimes it glows, and that's when very sensitive people can see auras. Our plasma bodies, because we do have plasma bodies, are bigger than our physical bodies. So we're surrounded at least by 2 or 3 feet more of us that you can't see. And it often contains dust, microscopic dust that you can't see, and microbes. And a lot of work on that was done by this man, Freeman Cope. I won't go into too much more detail, but we are surrounded by these swirly bits that you just can't see them. And it's important to know that. There's more to us than we think.
It's our website. We're on camera 24/7.
Good-o. Now, I was talking about the filaments. One of these shows the universal cosmic web, and the other is the human brain. You can see that this is a fractal phenomenon. The patterns are the same at different scales. Universal patterns recur at scales of high scales and low scales, but it's the same. It's because filaments are fundamental, as I was saying before. Now, this is a Yukawa ball made of dust, held together by plasma. This is microscopic. Now, the interesting thing about the Yukawa ball, which is named after a very brilliant Japanese scientist called Professor Yukawa, I highly recommend him to you. His book, unfortunately, he's not with us, but the book remains. He discovered that this ball is made of layers, ordered layers. It's geometrically constructed on its own, spontaneous self-organization of a perfect geometrical shape, layer surrounded by layer, surrounded by layers, like an onion growing. And it's a plasma dust ball. Now, this is very important because they can exist on a huge scale. I was mentioning the nebulae, they're sort of swirly, but you can have highly structured plasma dust clouds. And there are 2 giant clouds near the Earth, which together are 18 times the size of the Earth. In other words, each one is 9 times the size of the Earth. And there are 2 particular points between the Earth and the Moon called Lagrange points, or L points. And that's where the gravity of the Moon and the gravity of Earth cancel out, and you can just sit there and you won't have any gravitational pull on you. And so these clouds are centered around those 2 points. And they are, as I said, together 18 times the size of the Earth, which is big for us. And what this means is that we do not have an Earth and Moon system. We live in a 2-cloud system with an Earth and a Moon thrown in, because the Earth and the Moon barely count compared to those giant clouds. And guess what those giant clouds are? They are gigantic plasma dust clouds. Now, this is where we come to Professor Tsitovich. And I have to say at this point, I have to take my hat off. If I had one on, I would take it off straight away for our good friend Andrew Collins. He's very, very naughty because he talked a lot about plasma before I ever did. And he even knew about Professor Citowicz, who's key to everything. So in his book, Light Quest, which I call to everyone's attention, he discussed a lot of these points. He didn't necessarily follow them all through enormously, because he's always doing too much at once. But the fact is that he was several years ahead of me, and I have to give him credit for that. So Professor Citowicz, who has now died, alas, was a totally brilliant Russian scientific genius who, it's not him, I'll tell you who he is in a moment. He's Polish. And Citowicz, in the lab, was able to create plasma dust clouds and watch them form and watch their behavior. And he published many papers. And he was able to explain that they form by self-organization without being told what to do. And this is called the process of emergence, which is a bit of a buzzword. And that they would go on and on improving their structure and arrangement until they developed rudimentary, and then less rudimentary, and then less rudimentary intelligence. Plasma dust clouds developing intelligence of a kind of AI nature. But I mean, we don't know if they feel or have emotions. But the fact is that he was able to prove conclusively that self-organized plasma dust clouds not only can, but usually do, form what we can only call entities. Well, let's just extrapolate that. So here is Dr. Kazimierz Cordylewski, a Polish scientist in 1961, and he has discovered the two giant clouds which he has depicted. That's the Earth in the middle, Ziemia, and Syzyk is the moon, which is going around the Earth. And so the the giant dust clouds, and that's just one of them, the other one he hasn't drawn, are 60 degrees either side of the moon. So I say they're between the Earth and the moon, but they're not in a direct line of sight. It wouldn't matter if they were, because they don't emit any light. You could see through them. But never mind. They're at these Lagrange points, which are 60 degrees either side of the moon looking up. And so that's him drawing it on a big blackboard. And the Polish government, the Polish communist government, did not like this. And he was forced to stop work. And he had to stop practicing as a scientist. And he was unable to carry this research further. Now, those two clouds that he mentioned are named the Cordylewski clouds after him, but nobody could find them again because they don't emit light, and it's very, very difficult to detect them. And 2 or 3 scientific groups tried and failed, and they said, well, he's probably imagining things. But in 2018, a Hungarian team actually was able to confirm them in a way that was absolute proof that they really are there. And because I'm on something called researchgate.net, where my more technical papers are posted, you could go to that website and type in my name and they all come up. I heard about this and I was able to contact, as a member of ResearchGate, you can contact another member of ResearchGate, you see. I was able to contact the head of the Hungarian team, who was a woman, and therefore cleverer than us men, as we know. And so I said to her, are you studying the plasma aspects of these clouds? First, I congratulated her, of course, on her great achievement. And she replied right away, saying, no, we are studying celestial dynamics aspects. This made it plain to me she didn't really know what I was getting at. And this was what I needed to know. I don't think she even knew about the plasma aspects of dust clouds in space. Because she's an observational astronomer, how would she know about plasma physics? Anyway, I phoned up my very good friend of many decades, Chandra Vikramasinghe, whose name will be known to many of you. He was the protege of Fred Hoyle, the astronomer. And I said, Chandra, I told him, I said, there are these two clouds. Have you heard of the Cordylewski clouds? And no, because most people haven't. And I told him what they were. He said, we need to do a paper. Can we do a joint paper together, please? Just suggesting that these plasma clouds could be intelligent entities. And we did that for our journal called Astronomy and Astrophysics. Or no, I think it was called Advances in Astrophysics. They're all such similar titles. And we did publish that right away because we wanted to alert everybody fast. And then I was working on my book, and I included all of this. So if you read my book, A New Science of Heaven, you will find out all about the Cordylewski clouds. And here's a diagram to show you more clearly where they are. That's the Earth and the Moon. And you see 60 degrees either way, you've got these clouds. L4 and L5 are the numbers of the Lagrange points. There are further Lagrange points between the Earth and the Sun, but that's not what we're concerned with. The two Lagrange points relating to the Earth and the Moon are there. And that's where there is no gravitational pull. And you can sit there forever, as long as there's an Earth and a Moon, without being pulled in either direction. And that's a good resting place for these clouds, which may be billions of years old. And if you consider that these clouds together are 18 times the size of the Earth, the computing power of something so gigantic, trillions upon trillions upon trillions upon trillions upon trillions of elements, and full of plasmoids of different kinds linked by filaments, because plasma structures can be more complex than anatomical structures made of atoms. So, for instance, if there was a plasma person standing beside me, he would be more complicated inside than my anatomy. And that's true of all of us. And so those gigantic clouds, I didn't know what to think, because they probably, with that kind of computing power, they must know everything about the Earth. And if they're billions of years old, they have observed and doubtless monitored the entire history of this planet and everything and everybody on it. And that means that they're listening to us now because they would have perfected all such means. And so I phoned my friend, I phoned a friend who bends spoons. And I said, what do you think? Of course, he didn't know about the clouds. I said, what do you think? He said, well, Robert, my immediate reaction to you telling me about them is they've been placed there. They didn't slowly evolve and just grow and become so huge. They were placed there by a highly advanced alien civilization. That was his take on it, Yuri. And I mentioned that because he's a psychic and that's his take. But the thing is that the clouds are there, however they got there, and that they are bound to be intelligent. There's no way they could not be. And that means that they must be super intelligent because they're so gigantic. And they have more computing power than anything. All the computers on the Earth combined couldn't even hold a finger to them. There's no comparison. And so then I thought, well, okay, how do they monitor us? And so I suddenly thought, well, of course they do that with ball lightning and such things. That would explain a lot of so-called UFOs. The glowing balls that go zigzag, zigzag and do things that nobody on board could survive and all those crazy things. And so there's a lot of research been done on ball lightning. There are many, many, many books on that subject. And I read a lot of them. And ball lightning, it seems that it's composed of plasma, glowing plasma, or blazing plasma. And it can do different things. It can bounce on the ground, or it can pass through walls and come through intact on the other side, which is what ghosts are supposed to do, aren't they? And so my personal view is that we are all plasma beings, temporarily embodied in physical bodies, and that when we do what's called dying, our bodies wear out or get crushed in an accident or whatever happens, we have to leave them and we float off and fly away, as the Egyptians would say, as a ba, hoping to become an ak. And that there's no such thing as dying in the sense of being exterminated. And that has its plus side and its negative side, because if you imagine that you cannot die no matter how hard you try, that means you're stuck with yourself, so you better smarten up. You don't want to be in the company of somebody that you think is disgusting, like yourself. So you've got to make yourself a better person and so on. That's obvious if you cannot die. And so my view of everything is that reincarnation is a fundamental, which makes perfect sense when you think about it. And if you aren't intensely prejudiced because of some fanatical religious belief that says you cannot do that, you have to be dependent on the priest. And so I believe that we are plasma beings, that we reincarnate, that we are eternal, and whether we like it or not, we cannot die. What happens in the other world, that's another matter. In between lives and so on, that's a separate discussion. But think about it. I'm sure you would all have your own separate views on that part of it. But if that's the case, and we live in a plasma universe, and we are plasma people, and our planet that we keep incarnating on is under the supervision of gigantic plasma clouds, which are entities of some kind, presumably AI-type intelligence, but we don't know that. Looking back into the origins and coming back to the theme of the conference, I want to say that what this means is, and why I'm going off into all this crazy plasma stuff, is that in terms of our ultimate origins, we come from plasma. That's more important than all the ancient civilizations, isn't it? Because that's where we ultimately come from and to which we keep returning. And so there's got to be a process of evolution here, and we keep trying to understand more, and that's our job, to understand. If you're in the physical world, you can achieve things. If you're in the plasma world, you can't necessarily achieve so much. I know there's a big struggle here. We get ill, our feelings get hurt. You know, I could take offense. I could identify as a mouse. But the thing is, we really do have to get a grip and keep pushing on our own development and the world's development. And there's that mysterious force that's even more mysterious than plasma. It's called love. Does anybody know what it is?
Love light of creation. Plasma.
Well done. So you see, this is all a positive message laden with a whole lot of mumbo-jumbo. But I'm saying this to you seriously. Our origins are from plasma. And a lot of the ancient civilizations sensed this through the shamans. They really did. A lot of the ancient knowledge is absolutely accurate because they were in telepathic contact. And I just want to add one thing about the clouds. I like to study the Gnostic texts. And there was a sect of Gnostics called the Marcosians who said that there were two giant entities between the earth and the moon, one of whom was called Metatron. Metatron. We all know that that name is very important in ancient Judaism and Gnostic Christianity. In fact, there's a chapter in my book, which I don't have time to tell you about, where I discuss Moses and the burning bush and Enoch and so on. And the story of Moses in the burning bush is interesting because it's often misrepresented. People say he went up on the mountain and God spoke to him. That's not what happened. The Bible is very specific. It says the angel of the Lord spoke to Moses from the burning bush, which was not a bush, by the way. It was like a bush. And it was burning but not consumed, clearly a plasma ball. And so the angel of the Lord, I did research, and according to the Samaritans, who were another sect of Jews who didn't like the Jerusalem ones one bit, and they said they were the real Jews, They preserved the name of the angel of the Lord, and guess what that was? It was Metatron. The same being who's said to be a giant entity between the earth and the moon by the Marcosians. So the ancient elements of all of this, I only have one chapter about that, but you could write many a book on following through with all of this, and go through all the Jewish texts, the early ones, and the Gnostic texts, and put together this great story about how those clouds have been sensed by the ancient cultures, by the ancient shamans. They were in some kind of harmonic resonance or telepathic contact with them, and this is why the ancient wisdom is so important. And Debbie's nice talk about the shamans is very important, because we need to do much more work on that subject. And as I was saying to her earlier, I always wished I could have gone to Siberia to meet a real shaman, but I wouldn't want him to be that black shaman that she showed the photo of, the last of the black shamans. But this is a big subject, and my book is just a start. I call it a kindergarten text, because it's meant to be a kind of primer, or like an operating manual that you consult as you try to work your way through what all of this really means for us. It's a starter. Let's all get going.